Alright, hello, this is video lecture number 88. Today we are talking about a suburban nation. Our subsections are the post-war housing boom, rise of the Sunbelt, and two nations, urban and suburban. So from the early days of the Republic until the early 20th century, Americans steadily moved from the country to the city. In fact, by 1920, the majority of the population lived in urban areas. However, in the years following World War II, this historic pattern changed, or rather underwent a significant variation, as millions of Americans moved from cities into the suburbs, with many businesses following suit. As a result, the country's older urban cores were hard hit in the post-war era, as they lost not only their tax base, but employment as well. Indeed, many inner cities went into a long, slow decline, while others, or parts of others, transformed by urban renewal projects. The appeal of home ownership, however, in these newer residential enclaves, especially to young families, was as irresistible as it was affordable. Given the combination of cheap energy, lower land and labor costs, low interest rates, and relatively inexpensive building materials. Highway construction, sponsored by the federal government, also helped foster the movement from city into suburb, as well as from the more settled states in the Northeast to the more sparsely settled Sunbelt states in the American West and South. The movement into the nation's Sunbelt, however, was not only east to west, but, as Carrie McWilliams points out, from Mexico to north of the U.S. border. Alright, so let's have a closer look then at the suburban nation, starting with the post-war housing boom. Americans began to leave older cities in the North and Midwest for newer ones in the South and West. There was also a major shift from the city to the suburbs. Both processes were stimulated by the dramatic growth of a car culture and the federal government's support of housing and highway initiatives. By 1960, 1/3 of Americans lived in suburbs. Because few new dwellings had been built during the Depression or war years, the country faced a housing shortage. But by 1960, the nation had added 25% of new housing stock since 1950. Arthur Levitt applied mass production techniques to home construction. Other developers followed suit in subdivisions all over the country, hastening the exodus from farms and cities. Many homes were financed with mortgages from the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the Veterans Administration at rates dramatically lower than those offered by private lenders, demonstrating the way the federal government was entering and influencing daily life. New suburban homes, as well as their funding, however, were reserved mostly for whites. Some homeowners had to sign a restrictive covenant prohibiting occupation in the development by blacks, Asians, or Jews. Although Shelley versus Kramer from 1948 ruled that restrictive covenants were illegal, the practice continued until the civil rights laws of the 1960s banned private discrimination. Now, highways were funded by federal government programs such as the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956, and then we see an increase in air pollution and traffic jams, and they soon became problems in cities. Now, as Americans began to drive also to suburban shopping malls and supermarkets, downtown retail economy dried up, helping to precipitate the decay of the central cities. Okay, our next section is Rise of the Sunbelt. New growth patterns were most striking in the South and West, where inexpensive land, unorganized labor, low taxes, and warm climate beckoned. California grew the most rapidly, containing 1/10 of the nation's population by 1970, surpassing New York as the most populous state. Now, a distinctive feature of Sunbelt suburbanization was its close relationship to the military-industrial complex. Military bases proliferated in the South and Southwest in the post-war decades, especially in Florida, Texas, and California. All right, our last section then today is two nations, urban and suburban. Between 1950 and 1960, the nation's 12 largest cities lost 3.6 million whites and gained 4.5 million non-whites. As affluent whites left the cities, urban tax revenues shrank, leading to the decay of services and infrastructure. Growing racial fears accelerated this, quote, white flight to the suburbs in the 1960s. In the inner cities, housing continued to be a crucial problem. Urban renewal produced grim, high-rise housing projects that destroyed community bonds and created anonymous open areas that were vulnerable to crime. Post-war urban areas then increasingly became places of last resort for America's poor. Once there, they faced unemployment, racial hostilities, and institutional barriers to mobility. Two separate Americas emerged: a largely white society in the suburbs and an inner city population comprised of blacks, Latinos, and other disadvantaged groups. In the turbulent decade to come, the contrast between suburban affluence and the other America would spawn growing demands for social change that the nation's leaders in the 1960s just could not ignore. With jobs and financial resources flowing out to the suburbs then, urban newcomers inherited a declining economy and a decaying environment, which we have called the other America. The War Brides Act, the Displaced Persons Act, the McCarran-Walter Act, and the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act all helped to create an influx of new immigrants to American cities. The federal government also welcomed Mexican labor under its Bracero program, which began during World War II, revived in 1951, and ended in 1964. Residents of Puerto Rico had been American citizens since 1917, so they were not subject to immigrant laws. They became America's first group to immigrate by air. Cuban refugees were the third largest group of Spanish-speaking immigrants. The Cuban Refugee community turned Miami into a cosmopolitan, bilingual city almost overnight. Spanish-speaking immigrants created huge barrios in major American cities where bilingualism flourished and the Catholic Church shaped religious life. Okay, so that's it. The main theme, I guess, for today is demographic shifts and migration shifts. This is important stuff to understand. Why Americans moved from one place of the country to another. Okay, so make sure you read this section very closely. Go ahead and answer your review questions and continue on with your work.